The dreary October day passed by slowly, dark clouds issuing endless torrents of rain that blew sideways in ferocious waves. I looked out of the office window, sighing. Another day of life wasted working in a job I hated. I felt like the rest of my life would be an endless procession of days like this, wasted in a dreary office drinking watery, cheap coffee, and making small talk with people who wouldn't care if I dropped dead right in front of them. When 5 o'clock came, I saved my work on the computer and ran out of the building. I was instantly soaked as the darkening clouds continued their onslaught. Lightning began to flash nearby, and a few seconds after, thunder followed, shaking the ground. Swearing, I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys to get it unlocked. By the time I sat down in the driver's seat, every article of clothing I had on was soaking wet. I turned on the heat and threw my briefcase on the passenger's seat, pulling out of the parking lot and merging onto the highway. Ahead, I saw flashing lights and got stuck in a traffic jam for the next 20 minutes, barely moving as a Lifestar helicopter landed not far away. As I inched along, I saw the billboard on my right. "We buy souls," it exclaimed in large, fiery letters. Souls. Whether new, slightly used, or heavily damaged, we are interested. Call 666-213 soul right now. I gaped at it in astonishment, then quickly took the number down in my cell phone. I thought for sure that it must be some sort of bizarre prank. Finally, the traffic began to move forwards again as a lane opened up, and in another 20 minutes, I was home. My house was a small, cookie-cutter replica of every other suburban house on the street, with a small lawn and an attached one-car garage. I pulled into it, grateful I wouldn't have to go back outside in the downpour, then grabbed my suitcase to go into my empty, lonely home. I made a sad dinner of instant noodles and beef jerky with Gatorade, looking at my phone for a long moment. Finally, I picked it up and dialed the number. After a single ring, a cheerful voice answered. "This is Ace Souls Incorporated. May I ask who's calling?" And so started a bizarre string of events that would ultimately end in total catastrophe. The office building they directed me to was in a rundown industrial area, a place filled with the homeless and drug addicts. It used to be one of the hubs for industry in the city, a place where countless people worked, but now most of the factory and warehouse buildings lay empty, slowly growing more and more dilapidated as the years progressed. I pulled up on a street filled with used needles and crack pipes, seeing a homeless man with no legs sleeping next to an empty bottle of vodka on the sidewalk. He had a ripped sign with the words, "Homeless veteran please help," scrawled in barely legible permanent marker on the front. I dropped a few spare quarters in the empty coffee cup next to the sign and walked past. The sign pointed down a dark, suspicious-looking alleyway with bright neon letters saying "A Souls Inc." I followed it past rancid dumpsters to a door on the side of an abandoned-looking factory building. I saw a bright red, glowing button next to the door and a black camera above it. I pressed the button, holding it down for a couple seconds. A jarring mechanical noise sounded for a moment before a pleasant woman's voice came in through the speaker. "Good evening," she said. "Do you have an appointment?" "I do," I said, looking down at the notes I had put into my phone. "I'm supposed to see a man named Randolph Forrest. My name is Kevin McNair." After a second's pause, I added, "He said to come anytime before 9 p.m. I heard murmuring on the other end of the line for a few moments, and then the door opened with a loud buzz. I looked down the alleyway, seeing a silhouette of a man standing there, just staring at me. His eyes seemed to glow black, shimmering in the shadows, but I couldn't make out any of the features on his face. I wondered if it was just a trick of the light. I quickly walked through the door, making sure it locked behind me. Then I shuddered. Despite being in a rundown area of the city, the interior of the business actually looked pretty nice. Freshly painted white walls gleamed under bright fluorescent lights. Posters lined both sides of the hallway, most of them advertising for the business. One had a man with gleaming eyes and a huge smile holding a stack of bills, with the writing exclaiming, "Don't get cheated. We beat all other offers." A pretty blonde receptionist sat at the front desk. She gave me a polite smile as I walked into the reception hall, showing bleached white teeth between her dark red lipstick. "Ah, Mr. McNair," she said. "Mr. Forrest is excited to see you. His office is the last one on the left." She pointed down the hall. Thanking her, I walked past, seeing the rest of the bizarre posters. One had a child looking dreamily into the distance as soldiers marched past in the background, with the caption, "I always wanted to be a great leader. Ace Souls made it a reality." I walked into the office With a sense of rising trepidation, part of me wanted to simply turn around and walk out, saying I had changed my mind. I could run back to the car and peel out of this slum and forget I ever saw that bizarre billboard. But my feet kept onwards towards Mr. Fora's office as if of their own accord. The hallway seemed extremely long. Finally, I made it to the last office. I saw the door stood open, and a man sat there, expectant, staring at me with curiosity. He looked extremely pale, as if he had never been outside a day in his life. His eyes were dark, contrasting heavily with the deathly white shade of his skin. He had a shaved head and an expensive suit on. As I walked in, I could smell the French cologne emanating from him. "Ah, Mr. McNair," he said, rising from his chair and giving me a crooked grin. He extended his hand. I walked over to the desk and grabbed it, shaking it. I felt like I had grabbed the hand of a corpse. A freezing, deathly cold seemed to radiate from his body, making me shiver. I shuddered as an icy chill passed down my back. "It is great to finally meet face to face." I nodded. "Thanks for meeting me at such a late hour," I said. "With work and everything, it's hard to make time sometimes." He nodded slowly and understanding, motioning for me to sit in the chair across the desk. I did, and we both sat down. "So tell me a little about yourself," he said. "I like to understand our clients as best as possible in order to ensure that we can give them the best experience possible." "Well, I'm 32, working in a dead-end office job with no friends and no girlfriend. I don't know how it got like this. I used to have lots of friends when I was younger." He nodded sympathetically. "It's like over time, more and more people just moved away or started families, and I fell further and further behind until I was left alone. I don't know, it seems to be the way life goes. I always wanted to be a writer, and I thought maybe one day I would be rich and famous, though really, I don't care about either of those. I just want to be mildly successful. As more and more time passes, however, I have come to realize that I'm probably just going to die as a faceless nobody, working my whole life without ever achieving any degree of happiness." I felt embarrassed to reveal so much about myself and quickly averted my face, turning away from the dark, staring eyes of Mr. Forrest. I felt as if I were dissolving in those strange eyes, as if they were a black ocean, and I just a piece of driftwood, endlessly getting thrown by the currents this way and that. For a moment, the blackness seemed to expand and take over the whites, and the pale skin seemed to grow even lighter, like the deathly pale sheen of an albino. But I blinked my eyes, and I found myself just sitting across the desk from a fairly normal-looking, pale man in a suit. Yes, Mr. McNair," he said, "that is a story I've heard many times. I think we can help you, though. It's what we do here, after all." He pulled out a piece of jet black paper from inside his desk. It shone like polished jet, glimmering under the bright office lights. I had never seen anything quite like it. Taking a quill pen from the corner of his desk, he dipped it in an inkwell and began writing. I saw the blood red ink forming into letters as his neat copperplate handwriting began to fill the page. After a few minutes of uncomfortable silence, he looked up, smiling. He held it out to me. "This is a standard contract," he said. "If you agree, just sign on the bottom." I looked at the piece of black paper, reading the official-looking title on top and Forrest's writing below. "The Pact of Worms." The title read, "I, Kevin McNair, do agree on October 20th, 2023 to sell my soul to Ace Souls Incorporated under the agency of Chairman Randolph Forrest, co-owner of said enterprise. In exchange, I wish to receive a sum of $1 million and a publishing contract for a novel. Payment will be taken when Ace Souls Incorporated decides it is appropriate. With free will and a stable mind, I do hereby sign this agreement. Upon signature, this agreement will be considered legally binding and may not be rescinded or changed in any way." I read the short contract, one eyebrow raised, feeling like I was on some sort of prank show. I expected to see cameras coming out of the corridors at any moment with laughing people asking, "Did you really think this was real?" But nothing of the sort happened. Mr. Forrest just continued to stare at me as I looked the black paper up and down. Sighing heavily, I took the quill pen and signed it. A week later, I was in the Bahamas, finishing up some short stories and editing the first chapters of my novel. A sweet-smelling tropical air blew through the open windows of the cabin I rented. I looked outside, seeing palm trees shaking on the beach from the strong breeze, the waves coming in endless torrents, crashing on the white sands under the starlight. I saw something coming up from the surf, silhouettes breaking through the dark waves. Blinking quickly, I got closer to the window. 3 pale creatures came up out of the water. Their movements were jerky and unnatural. They had twisted, broken legs and swollen black and purple torsos. Their mouths chattered constantly, their lipless jaws opening and closing, with stick-like, emaciated arms and crooked vampiric fingers. Their swollen, naked bodies looked like something dredged up from the oceans of hell. Their eyes were pure black, like the eyes I thought I had glimpsed in Mr. Forrest when I sat in his office. They looked protuberant, bursting from their heads like giant obsidian balls, lidless and glistening with predatory intelligence. They saw me staring at them through the window. I immediately ducked down, thinking fast. I heard soft, pattering footsteps nearing. Rising quickly, I raised myself to just a fraction of an inch above the windowsill, hoping they wouldn't see me. The way they walked was inhuman. They seemed to dance on their thin, broken legs, a jig that brought them to the right and back to the left in rapid, tapping movements. Their teeth seemed to chatter in time with the way they walked. I rose and began to run towards the front door, deciding to escape. I flung it wide open, and then I saw Mr. Forrest standing there. My heart stopped in my chest for a moment, all hope seeming to drain from my body. "Ah, Mr. McNair," he said, grinning widely at me. His skin bloodless and white, his eyes pure black and shining. "I think the time has come for your payment." Within seconds, the creatures came into sight behind him. I backed slowly into the cabin, dread filling my body. "It won't hurt too much," he said, crossing the threshold. The creatures came in behind him. They smelled like wet, rotting corpses, an odor like sickness, an infection emanating from their unnatural bodies. Their teeth chattered endlessly, a staccato repetition that pierced the silence inside the cabin. But I hadn't been idle while I waited. As soon as I had gotten to the Bahamas, I had gone to the run-down slums and asked around until I found a gun for sale. It was just a small .22 semi-automatic pistol, and I had greatly overpaid for it, but now I found that price small and meaningless. Staggering back towards the kitchen table, I grabbed it off the top and turned, firing at the creatures. As they came closer, I hit the first in the chest. Its skin, stretched thin and rotting and filled with rancid gases, exploded, showering the floor with black worms that slid out of the wound. They looked like a den of poisonous snakes, writhing as they all moved in different directions, entangling and slithering. The worms in the wound looked the same, and they came together, stitching the hole in the creature's chest closed again. Mr. Forrest laughed. "Oh, come now, Mr. McNair," he said in a genial tone. "You didn't think it would be that easy to get out of this, now did you?" After they forced me down on the table, the creatures began to kneel over me, spewing black worms into my mouth. I tried to keep my mouth closed, but Mr. Forrest came over and held my jaw open with superhuman strength. The first of the worms slid down, choking me, the odor of salt, rotting meat, and pus filling my mouth in a disgusting explosion of flavors. I could feel them wriggling and pushing against my esophagus. I gagged, trying to throw up, but more came, and then more, and soon I was lost in my inner screams and an unexplainable horror. I don't know how long I lay there, but it seemed eternal. I woke the next morning, still laying on the table. Blood streamed from my mouth. I saw the bright tropical sun shining in through the open window, and I rose. All the joy seemed to have gone out of the world. I felt I had lost something essential, and at that moment, I began to weep, wishing I could go back and change it.